Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, to those in the hall. Thank you for joining online, wherever in the world you may be. My name is Nick Barrett, and as you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm not from these parts. So please bear with me. However, hopefully, some, if not all of you, will have some English ancestors somewhere in your family tree, because if not, this probably won't be very interesting. What I want to do today is explain how you can trace and identify the agricultural labourers in your family tree. And believe me, there will be many, because as we'll see when I talk a little bit about the history of the agricultural labourer, the further back you go, the larger the percentage of the English population worked on the land, either as farmers or tenants of that land or working for those farmers. English society was predominantly rural up to the late 18th century. So anything before 1800, 1780, that sort of period, the chances are that most of your ancestors would have had some association with the land. And today we're going to explore a little bit more about how you can go about identifying them, finding a little bit more about the records that you're going to use, some online, some, I'm afraid, are locked away in those archives in England. It's a good excuse to come over and see the plot of land where your ancestor worked, as well as having a look at the records where you can identify and find out more about them. And then a little bit of context, but there is another talk on Saturday. Jen Baldwin is going to be talking also about agricultural labourers from some of that social context. So I'll cover that a little bit, but you might want to go to her talk as well. So let's start with a little bit of background reading. There are some fantastic resources already out there. So I'm sure quite a lot of your libraries will have copies of these materials. Our Village Ancestors, the most recent publication by Helen Osborne, and Ian Weller's book, My Ancestor Was an Agricultural Labourer. I have changed some of the spellings in this talk, but you'll see Ian has used the British version of labourer there. Apologies if that is slightly confusing. We'll be using the American version throughout. A little bit first, though, about where these agricultural labourers pop up. And you're most likely to encounter them with fairly familiar records. If you have done any research into your English ancestry, you should be familiar with our system of birth, marriage and death certification from 1837 onwards, where usually, but not always, the occupation of the parents registering the birth of a child are noted. Likewise, on a marriage certificate, the occupation of the groom and sometimes the bride, or on a death certificate, the occupation at death. These are usually really important clues as to what sort of work your ancestor did, and you may well spot agricultural labourer in that context. Likewise, on the census, often abbreviated to AGLABs. I'm sure you've heard about AGLABs quite a bit, and most people sigh at that point in the belief that they can't go any further back. I hope to really challenge that belief today. And really importantly, parish registers introduced in the 1530s, recording the baptism, marriage and burial of people who lived in local communities. And that's a really important point to start, because most of our ancestors, as I said, lived in fairly small communities. And you have to read around the historical context of the area where your ancestor came from. So this is where family history morphs quite quickly into local history as well. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do both. You need to do both. The further back in time you go, the more you need to understand the geography and the topography of where your ancestors lived. So if you have found an entry for an AGLAB on the census, have a look at the place of birth. And the further back in time you go, that place of birth becomes increasingly important, because the transportation networks weren't what they are today. There weren't extensive train networks to move people around, although recently in England, no one's been moving around because of all the train strikes, but that's just a personal gripe. People would travel as fast as they could walk, or if they were able to afford it, the pace of a horse. So communication and the ability to move around was really restricted. So maybe have a look at some historic maps. There were quite a few around. And they will show you the local bridleways, footpaths, and some of the highways or turnpikes, because that will connect all of these smaller local parishes, often villages, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the presentation, with some of the larger market towns, where the goods produced from the land were taken to be sold. So think about the local background, the context. And the other point is that many of these labourers, oh goodness, I haven't corrected that one, a lot of these labourers would have some limited movement according to the terms of their employment and the seasonality of their work. They didn't just do the same thing all year round, because once you start to understand a little bit about the rotation of the crops, there will be periods where they are sowing, growing the crops, harvesting the crops, preparing the land, rotating different crops around. You really need to start to think about what sort of farming took place in the area where your ancestors lived. I've talked there about quite a lot of the life if you were involved with horticulture and growing crops for production. But of course, many people looked after livestock as well, sheep, cattle. So the type of farming is really important when you're thinking what that agricultural labourer might have done all the time. And to help you with this, many of the county archives or main libraries have local study centres. You don't always need to go and visit them. Many have access to inquiry help points or have created research guides that will explain more about what they hold and how you can use those records to find out more about the local area. I've mentioned one series in particular, the Victoria County History. These are large volumes, all with red covers, and all created from the Victorian period onwards, hence Victoria County History. And as the name suggests, they provide histories of the various counties where your ancestors might have lived. And this will give you information about the local land and administrative structure, who owned what. Because again, as we'll see, the relationship between people and land was heavily controlled right the way through until the 19th century. So whilst there might be a little bit of movement for migrant labourers around different estates, you need to know who owned the estates and therefore what sort of records those landowners might have kept, in which you might then identify some of your agricultural labourer ancestors. Lots of mights, ifs and maybes there. And a lot of it does depend on the survival of the records and the quality of the records that were being created. A point about these records, that these were personal records, private records, created by the owners of the land, or more likely their steward, who had administered the land on their behalf, about a whole range of transactions. Some had to be kept, and we'll cover those when I look at court records, manorial courts, but others were a little bit more fluid and personal. A lot of stewards had to keep accounts of money being paid out to improve the land, or mend fences, or upkeep the roads and bridleways. And you might well find money being paid to people employed to do some of that work. They are probably agricultural labourers who are doing non-seasonal work on the side. So you might find your ag lads mentioned in some of these other contexts as well. We'll cover that in a second. And finally, a little bit about where you're likely to find some of these records. In a minute, I'm going to take you through some of the land surveys, which, as the name suggests, tells you more about land ownership and therefore where records might survive, but also some of these local administrative records, the administration of land, often private and often deposited in county archives. So you need to think a little bit about the type of material you're looking for, and therefore that will lead you to where it's likely to be kept. So we're going to walk through 4 major areas that cover the majority of English property. And this will help you identify local farms. Now, there's this myth that everybody worked on the land up to the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution happened, and everyone left the land and worked in factories. And I'll talk about industrial labourers on Saturday. But that isn't the case. Large parts of England were and still are very rural. and you can spot the extent of farms, current and potentially previous extents of farms, through these records here, which I'll walk through in turn. Starting with the National Farm Survey, created in 1943. These records have not yet been digitized, but I understand that they will be, and so you will soon be able to see them online. The records were created, as you might tell by the date, during the Second World War, when Britain's resources were coming under increasing pressure, and the Ministry for Agriculture and Fisheries, MAF, was responsible for trying to work out the productivity of land, encouraging and then requiring farms and farmers to increase productivity so that people could continue to be fed. So to do this, all of these farms were surveyed, and the maps are kept in record series MAF 73. And then detailed information about each of those farms was captured and recorded in a series of files stored in record series MAF 32. There is a National Archives guide, research guide online, that will explain more about how to access these maps and how then to use them to access the files. But I'm just going to walk you through the key points and give you an example. So, top left is one of the county sheets that you'll find in MAF 73. And as you can tell, each farm has been given its own extent through creating coloured delineations of the land that formed part of that farm. And the example I've chosen here is Day and Gents Farm. So the first thing you do is find out the county. This one is from Essex. And you use your local knowledge to work out roughly where on these ordnance survey sheets in MAF 73 the farm is likely to be. You'd then order that out. And there's some information there which I've circled in yellow, where you have the county code, 15. You have the parish code, in this case 18. It's the parish of Doddinghurst. And then the farm code, 301. Which then corresponds to the entry in the MAF 32 file. And the example here, bottom left, is the extract of the information relating to this property, this farm. So it confirms where it is. It gives you the name of the property, Day's Farm or Day Farm. Really importantly, the name of the farmer. And occasionally, if the farmer is a tenant farmer of a different owner, you'll get the information there too. Shows that it's situated in Brentwood, and then it tells you a little bit about the productivity of the farm. So it's a really great way to work out who is working the farm, and that might lead you to some of those farm records, either with the family or with former owners, to see whether they can shed any light on people who might have been working in that estate. So these records are not online yet. They will be digitized. But at the moment, you need to go to the National Archives or ask someone to go to the National Archives for you if you want to find them. So 1943, really key date. The next set of records was created just before the First World War. And they were produced by the Valuation Office. Those who might have heard me talk before, you will know that I do love my finance, particularly medieval state finance. This was created by the Inland Revenue to raise tax through rateable values of property. And so the Valuation Office was set up to survey the whole of the country and work out how much land was worth. And to do that, they once again used a series of ordnance survey maps. You can find those in series IR 121 to 135. And each property, once again, was given its own extent and a unique hereditament number. Essentially, it's a unique identifier for that property, which is then recorded in a corresponding field book in series IR 58. So once again, these records are at the National Archives. A lot of the maps and records for London are now being digitized. And there are plans, I believe, to extend to the rest of the country. But the London ones aren't giving a huge amount of use for agricultural labourers because it's such a large metropolitan area. However, for the rest of the country, these are a fantastic set of records. So here is an extract. This is from Dorchester And I've circled this property here. And it's a house, Maxgate House, but it also has various lands attached to it. But you can see the way the survey works. Whilst it was set up in 1910, a lot of the work happened from 1912 onwards, and some parts were curtailed by the impact of the First World War. But broadly speaking, there's pretty much nationwide coverage. And you can see that each plot of land was indicated with a red number. And plot 49 is interesting because a railway cuts across it. So the brackets show you that they're part of the same property. And each of those numbers you can then look up in the associated field book in series IR 58. And they tell you a little bit about the property. In this case, it's a house and garden. The extent, it's 1 acre, 2 roods, and a little bit about the owner and their interest. And it just gives you a description. This time it looks more at the property itself. But the same applies. It will tell you what sort of land and how large it was, and also its rateable value. So once again, you're getting a sense of who owned the farm. And you can then look for information about that owner in other sources, whether they have deposited any information in the county archive, whether the farm formed part of a much larger estate. So you can then go and look for those estate records. In a similar vein, there was another nationwide survey from 1836 onwards, and this is far more useful if you are looking for farms for a couple of reasons. The date's important because it coincides with the beginning of detailed census returns, 1841, particularly 1851, where you start to get ag lab recorded more frequently, though you often find it in 1841, to be fair. Now, what were tithes? Tithes were a medieval payment to the church from tithable lands in the parish, who were required to pay 1/10 of the produce grown on those lands to the church for the upkeep of the rector or occasionally the vicar, so that their practical needs were covered, so they had to concentrate on their spiritual needs. However, by 1836, the value of crops, particularly corn, had fluctuated wildly, and with people beginning to move away from rural areas into the emerging towns and cities to work in factories, and also the swallowing up of some of these lands, many of these rural vicars and rectors found that they were impoverished. So a decision was taken to change these rather arbitrary payments in kind, often corn, as I mentioned, into the tithe barn at particular points of the year, into a fixed monetary rent charge. So they got money instead of goods. And that was based on a rolling 7-year average of the price of corn prior to the date of the apportionment. To work out how much land was tithable and how much money should be then paid to the rector or the vicar in the parish, an apportionment was created. And this comprised 2 parts. A survey of the land in the parish, creating a map. The set at the National Archives is in IR 30, but there's usually 2 other maps created, and they're often held in the county archive as well. Alongside schedules setting out who owned and occupied the land, what the extent of that land was, and how much that land was worth. And those are in a set of records at the National Archives, IR 29. Now, these records have been digitized. They're on the genealogist. So if you've got a subscription there, you can access them, and they form part of their data collection. But these are really useful records because, once again, they give you a sense of all of the various lands in the parish. And this example is particularly interesting. You see those narrow, thin fields? That's a remnant of the old medieval strip farm system, which I'll come on to in a second. But the principle is very similar to the 1910 Valuation Office. Every bit of land has its number, and every number corresponds to an entry in the schedule itself. Once again, giving you information about who owned the land in the parish where your ancestors lived. So these will give you all of the landowners and the farmers. And they will then have employed people to do the work on that land, and therefore may well have kept their own records. As I said at the beginning, these are often personal records. They would need to have been deposited in an archive. But this gives you those really important clues to go digging a little bit deeper. So you've identified land ownership, and that will then lead you to look for records associated with the management of that land elsewhere, which is what we're going to look at in a second. Sometimes, though, you will find that there is no tithe apportionment. And that is because the land might have been previously subject to an enclosure award. Now, enclosure is a fairly technical process whereby land the people had the right to graze their cattle or sheep was removed. It was often associated with consolidating some of those smaller strip fields into larger fields, which were then hedged off so that one landowner would have access rather than lots of individuals. So the enclosure movement, pretty much from the 16th century into the 19th, relates to the change use of land and the restriction of people to graze on common land. And to compensate landowners who'd lost these rights, they were often given various allotments of land elsewhere. So this process is about the changing use of land and the compensation of landowners. So it was a little bit unfair, but it helps us find who these people were. The reason why they're often associated with the lack of a tithe award is that as well as changing the way the fields were structured or the right to graze was managed, people often took the opportunity to merge tithes into the land. Again, quite technical, but if that had happened, there was no need for a tithe apportionment. So if the area where your ancestors live has no tithe map, go and have a look for an enclosure award. Often held locally, and often really detailed, once again, about land use, who was compensated, the process by which people were consulted. Lots of interesting detail in all of these documents beyond the ones that I've mentioned already. Some enclosure awards, worth having a look. Very few have been digitized because they are quite cumbersome things, which means, once again, you need to go and find them in county archives, or there are some at the National Archives as well. Now, a lot of what I've said already just gets you a little bit more information about who owned the property, who owned the land. But our agricultural labourers were caught up in a landholding system that was quite complicated, but remained pretty much intact from the 11th century to the 19th. So I'll give a little bit of an overview about how this worked and how you can use this knowledge to find records relating to your ag labs. Now, the key date here is 1066. What on earth does 1066 have to do with our ancestors? Well, it's the date that William of Normandy invaded England, defeated and killed King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and then seized all land, apart from that owned by the church, into his personal possession. And he parceled some out to his followers, who then rewarded their followers. But the basic unit was something known as a manor. Each manor would have a lord, and the way land was held was regulated by the customs of the manor. Some people held land free of those customs. They still had to attend to various requirements. There was a manorial court held a couple of times each year. These people holding land free of the customs had to attend as jurors, but basically they could sell the land or do what they wanted. So they were the freehold tenants. The lord of the manor might keep some land to themselves. This was known as demesne land, and they might lease it out. So you might find leaseholders renting land from the lord, or possibly one of the freeholders. So those are your leasehold tenants. Everybody else held their land according to the customs of the manor, which meant they couldn't just pass it down through the family or sell it to somebody. They had to present themselves at the next manorial court to either inherit or sell that land. So these manorial courts are really important for customary tenants who held land according to the customs of the manor. So let's take an example. A customary tenant dies, and at the next court, notification of their death is recorded. The date when they died, but also usually the date that they had inherited the land themselves. So immediately you're getting some really crucial genealogical information. Alongside this would be the name of the next potential heir, usually, but not always, the oldest male, who had to present themselves at court to be admitted into the land. So at the death of the tenant, the land was surrendered back to the Lord. The next heir comes forward and is admitted, and this is recorded in the court rolls. Court rolls are written transactions of the business happening at each court, and that's where this information can be found. And they were then given a copy of that entry so that they could then take possession of their land. In case they were challenged, they could provide the evidence, yes, I am the legal landholder. And they were known as copyhold tenants, holding land according to the copy of the court in which they were admitted. Now, this isn't some ancient medieval thing. This system of landholding continued right the way through to 1925. It was only extinguished at that point. Now, many people had taken the opportunity to get rid of the system in the 19th century. But the further back you go, the more important these records are. And there were other classes of individual within the manor who don't hold land, but who are employed or required to serve on the land because that's the only way they could live. They didn't have a trade. They couldn't go to a factory. They weren't invented. They had to work the land, either to scrape together enough money to lease some land themselves. And often you see people and their families gradually acquiring land, so they go from husbandmen, farmers, to yeomen, building up a portfolio of land, and then they have a little bit of status. But often they were tied to the land. These are your traditional agricultural labourers. Up until the 14th or 15th century, they were essentially enslaved. They were tied to the land. They couldn't do anything other than work for their lords. They couldn't leave and go to another manor to get better wages, for example. They were tied to the land. This eventually changed as you get to the 15th and 16th centuries. But this is why locality is so important. There wasn't a free labour market. People couldn't just go off and find some work somewhere else. Apart from the fact there was no minimum wage and there was no means of communication. They were tied to the local area. They were reliant on the land for their living. Because if they were forced off the land, they would be treated as vagrants. And a lot of the Elizabethan poor laws were intended to stop people roaming around and living off parish relief because they couldn't afford to live. So as we'll come on to in a little bit later, when you have moments of population expansion and people aren't needed, or movements like the enclosure movement, moving from lots of small bits of land that people can farm to larger consolidated bits of land that moved people away from the land, you had a lot of issues with poverty, vagrancy, and the financial drain on parishes, which led to a change in the system in the 19th century. So we'll look at that in a second. But I've digressed. I do that a lot. I do apologise. Let's go back to the court rolls. They are fantastic. So let's say that you've got someone working on the land and they've got a little bit of property and they're a copyhold tenant. You can look them up in these court rolls because they're usually indexed by the names of the tenants. And these indexes survive from the 16th century onwards in larger numbers. And if you are lucky enough to find somebody, particularly working back from an entry in one of the census returns, or particularly the tithe apportionments from the 1830s onwards, you can then look up what they were holding in the court roll, and then you will find the date that they entered that land, and who held it before them. So essentially, it's a stepping stone back in time. Now, I've done various bits of research, and I found land in the possession of the same family for centuries, and it took me 20 minutes to go back 250, 260 years, because you just follow the index and look at the entry, and it tells you the date of death of the last tenant and the date they were admitted, so you can jump back and jump back. So it's a really great way to track your land-holding ancestors. So equally, as well as these court rolls, the owners of the land, these lords of the manor, conducted rentals and surveys. Rentals, finding out who owed rent. Surveys, as the name suggests, having a look at the extent of the land and whether or not income could be increased by consolidating land, or whether or not rents were too low compared to other neighbouring properties and they could be uplifted. So these rentals and surveys form part of this manorial administration, presided over by the Lord of the Manor's steward, who would also keep a whole range of other wider estate records. And these are the bits that are important, because they will tell you about how that land was managed, And often they will tell you about the payments to individuals who either worked the land or helped look after its upkeep. So the estate management element is really important, often linked to the accounts of the financial transactions that the stewards would make. Correspondence between stewards and local suppliers, or local bailiffs, or local farm managers looking after the farm hands are often kept. The upkeep and maintenance of the agricultural property, often including places where the agricultural labourers would sleep, are included in these estate records. So going back to the reason why you need to look at the wider history of the area, if you can identify the lord of the manor through the Victoria County history, let's say, you can then work out where these manorial and estate records are likely to be deposited. There is a manorial documents register at the National Archives, identifying, and you can search by parish or by the name of the manor, where these records are located. And then again, you will probably need to arrange a visit or have someone look up the records for you because they're rarely digitised. Oh, one last problem, they're in Latin. Sorry, I should have mentioned that up front, shouldn't I? Anything before the 1730s will be in Latin, and it's shorthand Latin. So heavily abbreviated and in Latin. So yeah, I didn't mention that, did I? That's what they look like. This is an example of a court roll. On the left, you've got an overall sense of the structure. So you've got the name of the manor, you've got the type of court that was held. That list of names is really interesting because those are the freeholders, those are the jurors. And they should all be present, but if they weren't, they'd have to pay a small amount of money to be excused duty. Their names will be captured as well. So these are great records to work out who is in each area. And then you have details of the hearing of that particular court. There's the Latin ad hanc curia. So to this court, and then it will list all the various details, the date the court sat, and any previous recitals of information. So this one comes from 1704. But look, it suddenly jumps into English. Whereas at a special court, Baron held for the said manor on the 22nd day of March, 1699. So occasionally they recite earlier documents or earlier transactions in English. So it's not all bad news. It really isn't. There is some hope for you. But the great thing is that once you get beyond 1730s, 1740s, you can compare the records because they're very formulaic. They use the same structures year in, year out. So you can go to an entry after 1734 and you can have a look at the English, and it should allow you to help translate the Latin from previous entries. So some hope for you there. But the real issue here is still to work out who these people were and how you can find out more about them. And as with many areas of life, people could live quite comfortably and calmly and quietly, and they may never interact with any official records other than perhaps their baptism, marriage, or burial, or after 1841 in a census return. It's unlikely our agricultural labourer ancestors had enough property to dispose of it in a will, so there's no point looking for probate records. You have to look for other pieces of information, and this will take you to the margins of society. And sadly, because of the seasonal nature of the work and the fact that everyone was at the mercy of a good or a bad harvest, agricultural labourers often had really tough times, and so are more likely to appear in records associated with poverty or during some of the really tumultuous periods of change in records associated with protest and prosecution. So I'm just going to walk you through some of these, where again, it's more likely to find the names of individuals. Newspapers are a fantastic source. And of course, many of these local publications have been digitised through the British Library and now published via Find My Past. And you will find a lot of focus on the ebb and flow of local village life. Right the way through into the 19th century, many even earlier, there wasn't an awful lot to fill newspapers. But you will find some really interesting statistical information, the price of corn and the location and times of various corn markets in the nearest town. So that will give you a sense of key moments in the life of your ag lab ancestor, particularly some of the factors that would influence a good or a bad year for them. So if you see a bad harvest being reported in the local press and falling grain prices, you might want to start thinking about some of the poverty records, because many people would be forced into living off the local parish or, from the 1840s, the state to survive. But they will also have things such as hiring fairs. So as you have the run-up to the harvest, lots of people power is required, because pre-mechanisation, pre-18th century, a lot of this hard manual work was done by hand. And we'll come on in a minute to some of the sources you can use and understand more about their experiences. So there would be hiring fairs, where the landowners would essentially do exactly as it says, hire their local hands to do that season's work. So it would be a great moment in the local economy. And these hiring fairs were very well attended. It was a chance for people to sign up and get work, to socialise, and they were often reported quite heavily in local newspapers. Likewise, I've mentioned already the seasonality, but harvests were celebrated. This was a key moment in local life. So there'll be harvest festivals, so connections with the church, often reports of how village activities would revolve around the harvest, and also a general sense of what our ag labs got up to. Every now and again, you see, even today, various weird events like cheese rolling down hills, or old-style football matches where two villages basically take it as an excuse to beat 7 bells out of each other. These are ancient traditions, some better or not, where the communities would come together, and our ag labs would be part of these. This would be the stuff that they look forward to. So that seasonality, that local life, forget tech and TV and all of that, this was what it was about, having fun. Often that fun could spill over into semi-violent activities. I've mentioned the old-style football, but pubs and hostelries, you may well find reports of brawls and things, and that's often recorded in newspapers as well. People loved a good gossip. But equally, our ag labs weren't just passive, enslaved folk working for other people's gain. They had a voice, and they used it at key moments. They would protest, particularly when you start to get the onset of mechanization. These labor-saving devices may have been more profitable for the owners of the land and very innovative in terms of better farming techniques, but they put jobs at risk. And our ag labs did not like that. And particularly in the 19th century, and especially the middle of the 19th century, there was an awful lot of upset, protests, riots. The swing riots in the 1830s. Captain Swing, a mythical figure, a bit like Robin Hood, I suppose, who was epitomized by various local groups as the person who will free them from the onset of mechanization. Luddites, again, breaking machines, not just in factories, but also many of the machines that were brought in to save money and also lose jobs. So there were lots of riots in that period, opposing mechanization, opposing progress in the eyes of those who were trying to introduce it, but a threat to those who were on the receiving end. So you have an awful lot of protest movements, which once again were reported in newspapers, but also saw people hauled up before the courts. We also have the beginning of unions, and some of the early ones were about workers' rights in factories, but many were agricultural unions. The Tolpuddle Martyrs created a friendly society to protect the interest of workers and look at joint pay negotiations to essentially put workers' rights and the rights of better pay at the heart of their campaign. Now, whilst some friendly societies were semi-legal, there was a crackdown because, again, this threatened many of the people in power who often held the parliamentary seat and wanted to control what went on in the local area. So this was a threat to their profitability. And the Tolpuddle Martyrs were tried and prosecuted and convicted of creating an illegal agricultural union and were sentenced to transportation. The public outcry was such that the verdict was overturned and they were recalled. But it just goes to show the lengths that many establishment figures would go to crack down on organised agricultural labourers coming together to fight for their rights. They were affected by the repeal of the Corn Laws. This was an attempt to prop up prices, but also to prevent the influx of much cheaper corn grown from the States and sent over to England, which again put many people into the sense that they were being unemployed. And this once again generated popular protests to the point where the Corn Laws restricting trade were repealed. The impact was that there was a lot of rural poverty. And there are various ways that you can search for your agricultural labourers. This goes back, poor law, it's not a Victorian thing. The very first poor laws were in the late 16th, early 17th century. The onset of enclosure and expanding land ownership to the extent where the smaller strip farms disappeared impacted the ability for people to work. So they were pushed out of their parishes. They could not find work. And because there wasn't really any mechanism to support them, they would wander the streets trying to find work, essentially becoming vagrants. And there was a disincentive for them to be looked after. They cost money. A lot of the poor relief was funded locally by the landowners. So they wanted to move people on back to the parish where they came from. So the early poor laws are punitive. They're intended to crack down on vagrancy. And whilst they did provide various ways to support the agricultural poor, it was really trying to keep them tied to land. There were a few poor houses set up and maintained, and quite a lot of this information is found in the so-called parish chest. So beyond the baptism, marriage and burial records, you've got a whole range of material relating to the regulation of poor relief for folk who couldn't work, or the maintenance of the houses where they had to stay. And these will be the agricultural labourers in our family trees. By the time you get to the 19th century, you start to get poor law unions established because the cost of maintaining a poor house or poor relief for many parishes was too much. But once they started to club together to form these unions, the cost was much more effective. And that's where you start to get a different approach to poverty. Once again, creating the sense of the workhouse, giving people who couldn't work the land anymore an opportunity to stay, but also making it quite punitive. So the workhouse was an extension of some of the Elizabethan poor laws from the 17th century, but on a much grander scale. And there's a fantastic resource, workhouses.org, where you can find out more about many of our ancestors who found themselves in the workhouse, particularly at certain times of the year. Think of that seasonality once again. Harvest, you're likely to get work. Winter, much harder. And that's why many people ended up in the workhouse, because they didn't have any money to support themselves. And also, it's a much tougher time of year to be out on the streets. Equally, you will find parish clearance schemes. And this is where you start to get the big shift of people from the countryside into the emerging towns and cities. So parish clearance schemes where the local folk essentially paid to have people move to another part of the country. So often rural areas where there's mechanisation, there are much larger farms being managed more productively for the owners. You don't need the people power, so it was easier to pay for them to move to somewhere like Manchester and get work in a factory. So you'll find lots of rural parishes paying to move people on. And they were often advertised, once again, in local newspapers. I'll touch briefly on crime and punishment, but the main place to look would be either in quarter session records, so some of those misdemeanours for drunken behaviour, petty theft, would be heard before local justices of the peace or magistrates, and those will be held 4 times a year. Those records are at the county archive, the quarter sessions. For more serious offences, rioting, unlawful activity around unions, those sorts of things, the chances are that local assize justices would hear those cases. And they were held 2, maybe 3 times a year on a regional basis. Those records are at the National Archives. And once again, newspapers are a great resource because the assizes were the staple diet for local newspapers about gossip and all sorts of stuff that was going on. So think of the assizes, worth having a look there. And finally, many people were encouraged to take the Queen's shilling in the Victorian period. So essentially, go into the military, become cannon fodder. So you'll find many people from rural parishes experiencing economic hardship, often recruiting to their local regiment. So once again, what county is your ancestor in? And then you can start to have a look and see whether there's a county regiment or a regiment situated in that county at a particular time who were recruiting or enlisting soldiers. And then you can start to look for their records in military service, which is a whole other talk. Many people emigrated, not just through forcible emigration, through some of the punishments meted out to the former penal colonies, initially in the States, increasingly Australia, but they chose to emigrate and were often paid to emigrate. So you may well find adverts in newspapers offering people the chance to start afresh, the offer of land to go and farm in many of the British colonies around the world. So worth having a look for any emigration schemes. Parish clearance wasn't just getting people out of the countryside into the towns to work in factories. In many cases, it was about completely removing them and giving them the chance to start afresh in another country. So I've talked a lot about how you can find out about where they worked by tracing the land, what sort of records are associated with that land ownership where you might find your aglabs mentioned, and a little bit more about the sort of events that would have impacted their lives, where else to go looking. These resources here, and this will be the subject of Jen's talk, I believe, on Saturday, give you a sense of what life was like. And I've just given you 3 examples. Others exist. Most county archives will have some sense of museum or collection in the that relates to rural life. But the main one here is the Museum of English Rural Life at the University of Reading, where you can find out what the seasonal work would look like, what sort of tools they'd have used, what sort of dress they'd have worn, what their diet might be. So really good contextual information. I like this next one because it's so unusual, the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library for English Folk Music. Because if you want to understand what their life was like, go and listen to a folk song. It talks of great hardship and hope, and in many ways, it's the memorialization of a way of life. And you'll find all sorts of folk musics at that collection there as well. So really great context, and that's the sound of their life. And finally, if you want to experience a little bit more about what life would have been like, you've got examples such as this one, the Wealdon Down Living History Museum, where you can go and experience and see what rural life would have felt like. So a little bit about the context of the clothes and the tools and the diet, a little bit about the sounds of their life, and a bit of experiential history as well. So a few final closing thoughts before I hand over for questions for about 10 minutes or so. Don't give up. Don't sigh when you see your aglab census return. Follow some of these steps. You might not be able to get any further back. You might not find an employment record, but you will get a sense of what their life was like, what the estate would have been, what conditions their lives would have been. It's really important to do that sort of context. Focus on that wider area and then use that to find the farm or estate. So if they're baptised or the family in a particular parish, overlay the administrative history. What are the manors or the estates? And then use that to see if there are any farm records or any records that might generate information about them or the context of their lives. And I think we'll leave on that last point. Think about their lifestyle. It's so different to what we do now. It's worthy of further exploration. Think of their diet. What did they eat? Think of the music. What did they hear? Think of the challenges. What did they understand about the lives around them? And that, for me, is what you can do if you find an aglab in your family tree. Thank you. Please feel free to leave feedback via the app. That should hopefully be on your phones, the first thing you downloaded when you got your confirmation to come. And if you want to get in touch or ask any questions that don't occur to you in the next 10 minutes or so, please feel free to reach out. You can get hold of me via those various contacts. So, With 10 minutes left, and having just covered the best part of 1,000 years of history, does anyone have any burning questions? We have some microphones near the back, and I think you have to go and stand near a mic if you want to ask a question so that our colleagues online can hear you. Who would like to ask a question? I saw a hand go up, but it's come down. Yes. Would you mind going near a mic? Sorry to march you around the room, but it just allows everyone online to hear the question.
I was wondering if there's any difference between a farmer, an agricultural laborer, and a gardener.
Great question. So a farmer is usually someone who owns or rents the land and derives the profit of that venture. And you will often find in census returns farmer of 30 acres employing 3 men. So that's that sort of status. And they can be yeoman farmer, they could be smallholders, they could be husbandmen, they could be large estate owners. So that's someone who looks after the land and employs others. That's the best way to think about it. The agricultural labourer is usually one of those people who are employed by someone else. They may not own or possess or lease any land themselves, possibly. They might have encroached on some of the common land and earn a little bit on the sides, a bit of poaching maybe. That's why they often appear in the court records. So they tend to be the employees. Gardener is a really interesting one because you have lots of market gardeners who specialize in particular lines of products. So they're somewhere between the two. You will have what I will call official gardeners who tend to work on estates but look after the manicured lawns and the topiary and the shrubs that make it all look nice. And then you will have specific market gardeners who are somewhere in between the two. They might lease land, they specialize in a particular area. So parts of London, which are now built up, used to be ripe for asparagus growing in the south. You know, you look at it now and you think, oh, that's a bit odd. But then you look at the street names and that tells you a bit of the history. So you have that sort of gardener. So there are two real categories there. The books that I mentioned at the beginning go through some of those categories in a bit more detail.
The National Archives, is that located in Kew?
It is, yes. So this is the National Archives of the UK. It's in Kew, which is southwest London. And on its website, nationalarchives.gov.uk, I think will still get you there. They have a series of research guides, and they will take you through many of the topics I've covered in more detail from a very practical sense, as in how to find records from the National Farm Survey, examples of what those records look like, and if they're not digitized, how you can go about getting access yourself.
I've been trying to find some Victorian county histories, and I can't find them for some counties.
So not all counties are
like
fully
Somerset,
covered.
I can't find, but I can find Devon.
Okay. More of these are being digitized on British History Online. You should be able to get access to at least the catalogue list. I was about to say the British Library, but the British Library, as I'll talk about tomorrow, has had a catastrophic hack. And a lot of its services are still down and may well be down for many months to come. So some are on the Internet Archive. But the other point is that there might not be a volume. It's not a complete set for all counties covering all parts. It's been going since the late 19th century, and new red books are being published still. It's a very slow process. We don't like to rush things in the UK. So if you want to get involved, the Institute of Historical Research, bear with me, the Institute of Historical Research, part of the School of Advanced Study, part of the University of London, has got further information about what's there and what's not. So try the IHR, that's the best place. Right, I've got people now competing for the mic. This is fantastic. I am going to go right to me left, so gentleman here, please.
Can you talk briefly on the mobility from ag lab labor to obtaining a skill and becoming a brickmaker? Because in a family where it's the same generation, seem to be ag laborers, and all of a sudden you've got one who's a brickmaker. What was that? What was the social dynamic, and what might that help us learn, or how could we learn about it from that perspective?
It's a really great question about people moving from ag lab to higher or perhaps more artisanal lines of work. So you did have an apprenticeship system, and craftspeople, often members of a guild, a trade guild or a craft guild, that had professional standards would take on apprentices and train them for 7 years in the skill so they could then go off and start their own line of business. But these were fairly competitive processes, as you can imagine, to get you out of working in the fields into a skill or a talent that you could take around anywhere else. Didn't guarantee you riches, but it at least gave you a different sort of career option. You could always fall back on Ag Lab if you needed to. So you would have key professions, and they would take on a number of apprentices each year. They'd have to pay an indenture stamp duty, so you can find records of many of these apprenticeship arrangements at the National Archives. These indentures to become an apprentice are in series, this is going to stretch me, IR1 I think it is. It's another Inland Revenue collection, but there is a research guide about it. So it might be about how you cultivate a good relationship with one of the tradespeople in your area, so that your son, usually sons, could then sign on as an apprentice. Various starting points for age, bearing in mind for many people there wasn't school. This was a great way to at least provide some sort of education. So it's not impossible for people to suddenly shift status or shift occupation. It just often didn't affect many people because there was a finite number of skills and therefore a finite number of apprentices that could be taken on at any one time.
I have a follow-up question directly related to that. My direct ancestor that came from England, they were ag labs for 3 or 4 decades. Then, as occupation, they started to be listed as thatchers. My direct ancestor, his brother, his son, and so is thatcher a kind of trade that's separate?
So thatcher.
Yes.
So again, very skilled profession, hugely skilled, and it's still being taught and trained in various specialist colleges here today. Once again, because it was so skilled, you would take on apprentices. So I would wager that your ancestor might have started out as an apprentice and then took up the trade and made sure that their sons also became part of those apprentices, often to others outside of the family, but sometimes within the family as well. Thatching was one of those areas where the byproduct, sometimes of farming, sometimes of direct cultivation of reed beds, produced materials that were used to, as the name suggests, thatch many of the agricultural cottages or labourers' cottages where people lived. So again, it's that sense of a closed community, people being selected to take part, possibly because they've shown an interest or a flair in that subject. Maybe an apprenticeship, possibly, you might find some records there. But as new materials started to come in, it sort of died out as you get into the 19th century. Lots of places started to use slate and then tile, and so thatching tended to remain areas which were less industrialized. So probably an apprenticeship route, possibly through some sort of local connection.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got time for one last before I lose those online.
How many ag lab people became miners or went back and forth between ag lab and miners?
Great question, quite a lot. And again, I think it depends on what you saw as the least worst option. Now, mining would give you a steady income, but it was very dangerous and difficult work. And many people tried to keep hold of small chunks of land simply to avoid having to go down the mine. But of course, if it's a choice of starving to death because there's no work or going down the mine, people would do so. And many rural areas would find that they were exporting people to different parts of Britain. So Cornwall, known for its tin mines, and as the tin mining stopped, people would travel long distances to go into coal mining in Nottinghamshire and further north, Durham. So you might find people born in Cornwall appearing in some strange places, but they might well take up agricultural labouring along the way. So great question, and I think that just shows the interchangeability of many of these jobs. People had to do whatever it takes to survive. It was really tough and grim. So I'm not going to romanticize about the life of the ag labs. It was hard work. And sometimes you had to make these difficult decisions. So people would switch around. It wasn't, oh, I'm a coal miner, I couldn't possibly do that. You did what you needed to do to survive. I can't see any more questions from the hall. We are about to lose those online. Thank you for joining. And thank you for those who are here in person. I hope that's been of some use. Thank you.